welcome to all of the people here. As one of the locals here, I feel I should probably not only welcome you, but also, as we have to do all summer here, apologize for the weather, which is not what people expect of California weather. Being an Englishman, I'm used to apologizing for the weather, so it comes easy to me. The sun may be out tomorrow. It's what we always say here. I'm particularly pleased, but also honored and a little daunted to be talking on the subject of history here. As Terry said, I come from the School of Information. I was impressed with the website, had the campanile in the middle of it, which I assumed stood for the eye that we're all studying. Just opposite it, in fact, is strangely the newest school in some ways on campus and the oldest building. That's where the School of Information is. It, in fact, had the anomalous celebration last year, or this year. It celebrated 100 years since the founding of the library school, which is what the school was, and also the 25th anniversary of when the library school was disbanded and replaced by a School of Information. And that, in some ways, is part of the theme of what I want to talk about today, is how many different notions of information we have to play with, and how both, as we all know, contemporaneously and historically, drawing these together, just as drawing them together on a campus, can be challenging things to do. So let me give you just a quick overview of what I want to do. I'm going to talk about history. As I say, for reasons I'll be a little nervous about doing that, though I'm glad in a couple of the talks I've been to, historical aspects have come up. I want to talk then about the question of history in the context of information. And then I want to focus on a particular aspect of history that interests me, and that's the 18th century developments of the notion of information. And then in the end, as my talk is called, and I'll explain why it's called that in a minute, though we might have some idea, of connecting the dots. That is, I don't want simply to say that history has to be justified by being relevant to the present, but I do think there are aspects of this history that bear on the present, and I hope will be illuminating to some of us, if indeed they're not already well known to you. So, to begin with, on the question of history, I come to this topic not as a historian, I'm afraid, but in the School of Information about 15 years ago now, a colleague of mine and I thought, shouldn't a School of Information have a course on the history of information? And neither of us were historians, but we thought we'd put this together, but the first thing you tend to do, give away about certain aspects of academic life here, as you look around the world and see, well, who else is teaching a history of information? What can we pilfer from them? So we did an extensive search and discovered no courses on the history of information. So we were in thinking that we'd be going onto well-trodden ground. We discovered ourselves in a complete uncharted territory. Nonetheless, we launched the course for an undergraduate course here and have been teaching it ever since. We get at the end of every semester, we teach it an evaluation, and in some ways, one of my favorite evaluations, and I think in some ways one of the most insightful of the challenges, to the question on the evaluation, what didn't you like about the history of information? A simple one-word answer. Now, of course, there are certain oddities in that if you decided 15 weeks earlier to take a course called The History of Information, and at the end you announced you didn't like history. But I felt it was revealing in a way in that we had, for the most part, a room full of people who felt, not full, no, it's unfair, but at least some people in the room who felt that information doesn't have a history. Information is contemporary. All this ancient, distant stuff that we'd gone through had no bearing on where we live today. And if that might seem, for a while, a sort of juvenile undergraduate view, interesting quotation from an article in the New Yorker with a significant figure from Silicon Valley, Lewandowski. He was working for Google for a long time and then went to Uber and has been accused of taking a great deal of Google's work to Uber with him. But in the interview, he announced, the only thing that matters is the future. I don't even know why we study history. It's entertaining, I guess, the dinosaurs, Neanderthals, Industrial Revolution and stuff like that, but what already happened doesn't really matter. You don't need to know that history to build on what they made. In technology, all that matters is tomorrow. I actually did discover that Lewandowski, in fact, is a former Berkeley student. So I haven't looked back at my own records to see whether he could possibly have written that evaluation of my course, but if not, at least there's a sign that other people felt the same thing. But indeed, there is in some ways a comforting aspect of information, goes back in some ways to the announcement of the age of information, to McLuhan, an enormously influential figure here who said, the new age of information, and in that, the medium is the message, another of his famous phrases, and we live in the global village. And this idea in some ways that, understandable, we've done this, for example, with notions of the print revolution, that we've moved into a new world, that then people moved into a new world and left the past behind. So again, the claim is here in some ways that the past doesn't matter, that all we need to look at is the present. Hartley, the novelist, opens it with a nice phrase, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, and if you're like Lewandowski, and he says, and who cares what they do there? What matters is what we do. But on the other hand, if there is that notion that information in some ways allows us to disconnect from the past, I think we also have to bear in mind perhaps it's the reverse. Kipling, the English poet, said, having grown up in overseas, he said, what should they know of England who only England know? And in a way, I want to suggest that the claim that the age of information is distinct and different, in fact, has a historical imperative built into it. You can only make that claim if you know something about the past which you're denouncing. It doesn't so much remove the obligation to look at the past, it instills an obligation to look at the past. And in fact, luckily for me, because I feel not with audiences like this, but other audiences, people like Hartley and Kipling don't really ring a lot. In fact, at commencement at Stanford, Steve Jobs said, you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backward, giving me some tech confidence. But also, in fact, if you think back to what Lewandowski said, somebody who's working in machine learning, where in many ways do we look for machine learning? We look at patterns in the past in order to build patterns for the future. So that idea that it doesn't matter, rather than what we need to do is connect the dots, strikes me as mistaken, but as I've said, it's something that in the course I have had to do a fair amount of persuading people. I hope I don't have to do too much in this room, but if I do, at least I hope you might just regard it as passing entertainment at the end of a second day of a conference. This image is one that we use a good deal in the course. It's in some sense the map. We call it our curve. And it goes from, well, 50,000 plus more years on this axis back to the finding of early objects that clearly people have at one form or another painted on, in this case, scratched cave drawings and the like, and to go from cave painting to social media, Twitter, in 15 weeks is moving at a fairly fast pace. It has certain usefulness in that you can always say we don't have time to talk about that, about almost anything along the way, so embarrassing questions can be put to one side. But it does raise a lot of questions as you look back in any way about when to begin, what to study, and in some ways, as I've been talking about, why should we bother studying history around information? As Terry said kindly before I came up, I'm actually, again, not a historian, have been co-opted, I should say, no, kindly invited by 3 other historians to join them in putting together the Princeton Companion to the History of Information. I can't show you the title page of that because it's not out yet. We hope it will be out next year. And we faced in that all these questions. Within the limitation of a single volume, when should you begin, what should you study, and why? And I'll try as I go along to talk perhaps a little about that, but more in some ways to locate why my interests for today are in the 18th century and what I hope that can tell us about the history of information. One of the challenges about working out when to begin is, McLuhan happily said, we've now entered the age of information, but since then people have made much larger claims that we never were not in an age of information. Andrew Ottinger from MIT, linguist and computer scientist to some degree, just claimed every society is an information society. Robert Darnton, the very influential Harvard historian, then said every age is an information age. Again, so we now got the sort of any social collective is an information collective. There is no historical cutoff that we can comfortably turn our back on. And then Fred Dretske, the philosopher, simply begins his book with the phrase, "In the beginning there was information." So he now takes it back even from social configurations that Ottinger and Darnton talk about, and so I suggest he's really indicating that if you want to go back historically, you have to go back to the Big Bang, that nothing can challenge that. And those questions where, as I want to suggest, some people, as with our course, we're looking at physical objects. Other people are suggesting, well, perhaps we should begin with the computer. Perhaps we should begin with Babbage and the difference engine. That at least seems to heart our information age. Though interestingly, Babbage, in fact, never even comes close to talking about information in the context of the computer. For him, his machine, his engine, he will talk about information on the telegraph, but information for him has nothing to do with computers. But in general, that's usually seen as a safe place to stop when we look at information. Within that difficult world, then, is the question of, well, even if you can justify in some ways a period, can you say what exactly it is you're studying? Dretske's line, "In the beginning there was information," is followed by the next line, "The word came later." So do you go back to the beginning, or do you go to when the word begins? And that raises questions about what is it we're looking at. Are we looking at this word? Are we looking at the concept that this word maps onto? And can we therefore trace those historically? And is information then a term we're looking at? Or, and I'll come a little more into that, but one of the challenges of the word, and one thing that you see people doing in various kinds of history is saying, well, we're going to define information as such and such. Again, a huge challenge, a paper by Chaim Zins, an interesting one. He looked at 45 information scholars. Now, he's talking mostly about library and information scientists, and he asked them to define information, or looked at their work where they define information. Out of 45 people from 16 countries, he felt that there were 130 distinct definitions of what information was. So the idea that in some way we can find a coherent, simple definition that people will share is a little challenging. And you see, when you look at books, and some people try to say, well, I'll tell you what information is for this book. Cortada's book came out a couple of years ago, All the Facts. You probably can't see the subtitle. It's a history of information in the United States from 1870, I think. So he likes to have several fairly sharp cutoffs, a place and a time. But then he simply comes up, information is a collection of ideas mixed with data. Well, I don't think that constrains you very much as you talk about things, but on the other hand, how useful then is it? Obviously within the context of his book, which is very much based on Alfred Chandler's work, it's probably useful. Coming over to Berkeley, Carl Shapiro, an economist, a very important economist who's still here, Halverian, who actually founded the School of Information before moving on to be chief scientist at Google. They wrote a book on information rules, and they simply say information is anything that can be digitized. It's a strange kind of post facto definition, but nonetheless, it just seems to say it's all there. There are no restrictions. And then there's the famous, and again connected with Berkeley because Bateson was on the UC Board of Regents, information is a difference that makes a difference. Very much influenced by Claude Shannon. and is in some ways intriguing in the causal implications within it. As I'll suggest later, some subjective ideas in it. But in putting together this companion to the history of information and marshalling 100 academics to get their pieces together, and probably everyone in this room will know that when people amusingly use the metaphor of herding cats, herding academics is an entirely different level altogether. Nonetheless, one thing that ran through their different accounts was that many of them relied on Bateson's definition as an important definition. So again, the question of what to study. One place I looked at is much helped by Terry, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, looking at conceptual antecedents. It's an interesting line there under the heading History of Information, or Philosophy of Information, and then History. Until the second half of the 20th century, almost no modern philosopher considered information to be an important philosophical concept. And I'll come back to that, this idea that for a long time, information wasn't seen as the least important. When the critic Raymond Williams put together the piece Keywords in the 1960s, enormously influential. So we all talk about keywords now and much shaped by that. Information wasn't in it. He didn't think it needed to be, and no critic said, why isn't information in this book? It wasn't seen as a keyword. In the 1960s, around the time that McLuhan was claiming this is the age of information. But it says so. Then it says the term has no lemma in two encyclopedias, and mention how, like Raymond Williams' Keywords, these books didn't seem to think that information was important. Then in classical philosophy, information was a technical notion associated with the theory of knowledge and ontology that originated in Plato, theory of forms, developed in a number of his dialogues, and then it lists the dialogues. One intriguing thing about that, for me, is as we're trying to say what is it we want to study, is that we move from concept to term to lemma to notion within this paragraph. And still that question, well, what is it we're meant to be studying here? And then we sort of move rather hastily to epistemology. Looking at that, it's interesting just to say, well, let's begin there. Let's look at that. And so you go to, I use the Oxford Scholarly edition sort of from multiple years, different editions available online. You look at the works that are outlined here as being seminal to the philosophy of information. And if you look in the Phaedo and the Timaeus, information as a term doesn't come up at all. If you look at Phaedrus, as it comes up once, reflections with intelligence and information. In the Republic, it comes up just once. Our only sources of knowledge and information about gods, the tradition, and the poet. And there you see that information is kind of synonymous with knowledge or intelligence. It doesn't have any distinct character. It certainly doesn't seem to be being used to address questions of form, fundamental Platonic ideas. Does come up 4 times in the symposium, gains some pieces of information and lose others, single items of information, the leakage of information, which I find a very odd concept, and vanishing information. There, again, fairly modern notions, the idea of information as pieces or as items, which I shall talk about. But in general, there's no sense in that information is a critical term for understanding Platonic philosophy. So is it the concept and we just ignore the word? One thing in passing, which I'll come back to later, which they don't mention here, is in the laws, where it's in fact mentioned multiple times. And I'll say why in a moment. So in all that, what I want to say is that the challenges of trying to understand where we're going in historical accounts are multiple. One is that of the sort of multiple definitions. One is the fact that the term is regularly overlooked. In particular, if we say, well, let's look at the word, does that bring out, and as an Anglo myself, I should talk about Anglo-imperialistic prejudices, and this is one. We kind of wish on other people this term and say, you know, information is somehow universal, and that on the other hand, we take a privileged view of it from the English-speaking countries. And in fact, I think that's true in some ways. I'm intrigued, for interesting, at looking at the term of informatization, which we hardly use at all. It came up in France in the 80s or the 70s. In fact, Nora Mink's account that gave rise to Minitel, which in some ways is a forerunner of the internet, something none of us will usually talk about or hear about now, enormously significant. Came up also in Japan at the same time, came up as a major movement in China in the 2000s. In some sense, you see in that term, it's a reaction, it's a fear of the English-speaking world, almost. It's China and Japan and France at the time saying, what are we going to do about these people who are almost becoming newly colonial with these concepts and technologies of information, and producing this strange term. Equally, in France, I mean, France has had the term information for a long time. Les infos, the news. I was intrigued that a colleague of mine in France told me that his kids now tend no longer to use info for the news, that it's almost, again, the English usage of the term has taken over, and now it's les nouvelles rather than les infos. Equally, I was teaching a couple of years ago in Lille, and I found, talking about different texts of information, one of the challenges was that most of the students reading these texts felt they were reading texts in a foreign language, and that the fault was theirs if they didn't understand information. And I said, no, it's usually I felt, it's very much usually the author's fault, that they're not coherent or consistent in the ways they use information. But if you come from a foreign country, you tend to feel much more obliged to defer to some assumption of coherence with a term so important. So that's one of the tricky aspects. Again, should we use information as a term for analysis? If we put it to one side, what do we place it with? Is there a coherent concept that we can take across space and across time? I think both of those, the trouble is the answer is no, and therefore, for most of the people in this room, we do have to ask ourselves, in some sense, what is it that unites us? I want to say also one of the oddities of the English usage is that it's a highly self-effacing term. I'll explain that a little more in a minute, but it does tend to be one that we tend, in some sense, not to draw attention to. It tends to be taken for granted, so very often we just assume everybody in the room is talking about the same thing. I teach another course in the School of Information called Concepts of Information, in which I look at the way that different disciplines use information. And there is an extraordinary assumption, and there is, in fact, if you teach in a School of Information, that we're all talking about the same thing, and therefore we can talk to one another. But when, in fact, you look at the ways this concept is being used, not now across different times, but at the same time across different disciplines, even within the same language, the variety can be extraordinary. And the other thing is, as I say, so it's often used, it's rarely mentioned. That's in the linguistic distinction between use and mention. It's rarely directly referred to. It's simply used as if we all know anyway. And I say never index. That's a little over-exaggeration, but there is a strange way in which books, even with books which have have information in the title, won't put information in the index. It isn't something they feel they have to explain or to justify or to locate within the book. And I suspect that one of those aspects is that information has in many ways turned out to be what I call a useful fellow traveler. And that is in particular in the realm of epistemology. That is, the minute we bring up the word knowledge, we have to go into all sorts of challenging epistemological questions about, what is knowledge? Do we have to know that we know it? A whole philosophical world taking us back to Plato. And information so often, I think, allows us to skip around that. And you see occasionally that pairing of knowledge and information, which I mentioned. And if we don't want to keep talking about knowledge, we just slip off into information and say that doesn't bring all the baggage with it. And I think that, that against things like understanding and reason, which I'll talk about in a moment or two, it has been able to get away without carrying, as I say, all that baggage on its back. So one of the other questions then to ask is sort of whose information, as I say, are we talking about? Who are the speakers that use this word or that use the concepts that we hope to reach with this word? James Glick, who wrote a slightly odd journalist's book about information, but came up with this very enigmatic phrase, in a way: in the long run, history is the story of information becoming aware of itself. Now, I'm not entirely sure what that means. I probably shouldn't have put it on a slide, but maybe, if I leave enough time, someone will explain it to me. But I think part of what I do think it's getting at is, in a sense, a shift to the emic from the etic, this anthropological term, not from the observer of a society, but from people within the society. When does society itself become reflective about its use of information, start to talk directly about either the concept or the word? So in that vein, again, looking at historians, Peter Burke, who wrote a very interesting book on the social history of knowledge, says his challenge is to find what early modern people, rather than the present author or his readers, considered to be knowledge. And there's one challenge then. Let's look at the people themselves, how they use this term, which is what I'll do in a minute, or how they use concepts that we now would replace or translate with this term. But let's look at their self-awareness about it rather than impose it on them and just say, well, they wouldn't know it, but they're using information. Equally, George Young says the real central theme of history is not what happened, but what people felt about it when it was happening. And I think there is some reward, I hope anyway, in what I go on to say, in actually looking at people trying to come to terms with this notion of information. The path then into English in some ways, again, this is back to the encyclopedia. The later authors like Cicero and Augustine discuss Platonic concepts in Latin. They use terms informare and informatio as translation for eidos, essence, idea, typos, type, morpheme, form. I mean, there you can see, again, now we have a whole range of concepts, and somehow through the word that Augustine uses, we're saying they're all grouped together. Now, do we have to talk about all of those when we talk historically? What ways can we parse those? In some ways, as I say, people didn't bother. That isn't the way that people use it. This is just an example that I like. One of the strange things about information is that it became a consummate term of paratext in the 17th and 18th century. It was always on the front page of books, on titles. It described books, so you can see the Academy of Pleasure, which was a kind of dictionary, the Muses Expositor, or a poetical dictionary for information of the mere English reader. The digested for the information of the ignorant. That's a way to advertise your book. I must try that myself. Compiled from the information of the most eminent merchants. I'll try that instead. It might be more successful. Collected and digested so that the possessors of this work may obtain any information they require. That's on the front page of all these quasi-dictionaries. Some of them actually don't even have information as one of the dictionary terms that they then use, even though they have it on the front page. Others that do don't define it in the ways in which it's used in the book. It's just this extraordinary term that we could throw around, clearly has some kind of marketing power, but doesn't incur any obligation on us. So that's kind of looking back at the challenges of it. And now I want to move from there, and I hope my time is going okay, to look a little now at, in some ways, what began there. How did it emerge in the 18th century into the English language, and what can that tell us, not only about then, but also perhaps about now? One thing that I note, this figure Vicessimus Nox, or Vicessimus Nox, an interesting figure, gives something of a challenge to McLuhan, because he announced quite happily in 1778, but though books are easily procured, yet even in this age of information, there are thousands of the lower class who cannot read. So there we already have it, the 18th century telling you we're the age of information. How come we can make special claims about the 20th century? He was a very well-read figure. He was a clergyman. He was a teacher. He was also an essayist. His essays went through multiple editions, so he was a widely read person. He, in fact, probably is now most famous for the elegant extracts, and that was an interesting aspect of post sort of copyright reconciliation in England in the 1770s, when finally it was decided that you could take pieces from earlier books and combine them, and he did that. He took poems from here and essays from there and built them into anthologies, starting to see information as this sort of labile stuff that you could easily move around. But looking across that century, I think you can see interesting developments which again have a bearing on the time, starting with John Locke. Again, glad to hear somebody's discussing Locke earlier today. In the great essay concerning human understanding, I mean, one of the most influential books of philosophy in history, and he, in the preface, has this wonderful self-deprecating account when he says, the essay was not meant for those who'd already mastered this subject, you know, really everybody else out there knows this, but for my own information. And the idea of writing a book for your information is intriguing in many ways. And you know, now we tend to think of information as stuff we put into books or stuff we take out of them. But this account of the process, we write books for our information. Writing is an educational process. In fact, the Dutch historian Huizinga, who you may know, who wrote Homo Ludens, he came actually to Berkeley in the 1930s, and he said the strange thing about America is that they don't treat writing as if it was a process of discovery. They treat it as if it's reporting on what you already know. And I think that that's still very much true, but I think what's interesting about Locke is he's telling us the reverse. We write books to discover, not to report. That isn't how we talk about it now, and in fact, looking at the end of the century at William Godwin, another philosopher, political philosopher, less well-known perhaps, but very influential, who takes a very different and much more 20th century view in a way. Authors who have formed the design of superseding their predecessors will be found not merely to have collected the scattered information that has been produced on the subject. Information is now just bits and pieces which you bring together, and a book is the idea of doing that, as I said, as Knox did in his anthologies. So from Locke to this process of discovery as information, to Godwin, to information just being these particles we can gather, I think has enormously significant philosophical but semantic understandings too. I would say we can also see that in the American Constitution. Interesting now, one couldn't imagine a document like this which only has the word information appear in it once. But in fact it is, he shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union, and that's what gave us the idea of a State of a Union address. So that seems a perfectly familiar phrase. We can manage that. But when we look at it being discussed, there are two very different accounts. At the time, Hamilton, in the secret draft, and he possibly was instrumental in this phrasing, put it this way: the president shall communicate to Congress all such matters as may be necessary for their information. Now, the idea of these matters are what you give them, and those matters produce information, is rather like the Lockean notion. Whereas when Story, the influential judge in the 19th century, discusses it, he says the great wisdom in requiring the president to lay before Congress all facts and information. And their information is more or less synonymous with fact. So again, I hope you can see that there's two different notions. One is, in some sense, a processual notion, that these matters will allow people to develop ideas. The other is simply there are these ideas that we can pass around. In fact, looking at English and looking at, in some ways, I would say the way in which it comes into scholarly matter, at least in the 18th century, takes me back to what I mentioned in the laws, how in fact the word information in translations of the Platonic laws comes in many times, but in this slightly odd phrase for us, to lay an information before the ruler, the magistrate, the judges. It's a Latin phrase, informatio pro rege. This is information for the king, and then it becomes for the court. It's a legal notion. Informatus non sum means that I haven't been briefed. And basically what it refers to is a document which allows judges to make decisions. That is, it is not a little item, it's a full argument, which is then something that people people can draw on to make their own decisions. And looking at how historians use the phrase across the 18th and into the 19th century, I was intrigued, again, from historical points of view. If you look at David Hume, he has a 6-volume History of England, a monster, in that he uses information, I think 38 times throughout in the text, and it's very much in this legal sense. It's to give an information to the sheriff, to the king, to magistrates, or information from ambassadors. It's a report or a document. Intriguing to look at Macaulay in now writing in the following century. He has as many hits in one volume as Hume does in all 6, so the term is spreading, people are using it more. It's used throughout, for the most part, in almost exactly the same way as a kind of legal document that in some ways shapes legal or military decisions. But what's intriguing is it also appears for him in the footnotes. And now it's the document that doesn't simply inform the king or the court, it's also the one that informs the historian. He's putting in there, said, this is a document that informed me. And so you can see information moving out of that sort of hierarchical role. At least the historians themselves are taking it on. What's intriguing, though, in terms of how we understand this term in modern terms, is both of these people are absolutely central in discussing the development of the press in the United Kingdom, and yet information never turns up in the discussions of the press. It isn't that item of news that we think of it now. It isn't the stuff that is passed around in a Habermasian view. As it starts to develop within books, and I told you it already is a paratext on the title page, it becomes something that is being commodified, clearly, and also quantified. People start to count information. Strangely enough, it had been a count noun, and it goes to a mass noun. You no longer have plurals. Nonetheless, people start to count it. So you get books saying things like it contains more necessary information than books 6 times the price, or it will be found to contain double the quantity of information ever before inserted in previous volumes. So now we're starting to say more information is better. And that's becoming a critical understanding that really wasn't there for previous generations. And with that idea, and this runs through, I think, our encounters with information, on the one side, we're always thinking more is better, and as soon as we think that, we start to think, is it really? And so Isaac de Pinto says the best book is not that, perhaps, which contains the greatest quantity of information. And you start to get qualifications. Instead of information just being inherently the same kind of thing, you get practical information, which is an interesting distinction I can talk about later. I'll pass it now. Personal, useful, good, and also bad and mistaken information. It starts to be qualified in different ways. And in that way, you see it in some ways quantification and qualification, but also building up into our ideas of statistics and data. This is John Sinclair, who introduced the concept of statistics, or the word statistics, to the English language. 21 volumes in Scotland of data about how each village was more or less composed, almost census-like data. And he starts to talk about a mass of curious and interesting information in any publication, minute, useful, additional information of importance, the mass of information. You start to see information simply being this stuff in pieces that we can accumulate, and the accumulation is significant. That starts to, in Vicissimus Knox's term, in another essay that he gives, to catch fire. The moderns are able to draw information and to catch the fire of public virtue. And he notes, and sedition, something it took Facebook a long time to understand, but he understood fairly quickly at the time. What I see as a very significant phrase is, he says, a sort of great enthusiasm in a way. The press ought to supply people with all the important information. Here come the discussions, as I'm saying, of the press and the public sphere, the Habermasian notions. And then he says, give them, the people, fair and full information, and they will do the thing that is right. Information is going to be something which will allow the public sphere. And this is very much the Habermasian argument. Let those people go into those cafes and talk, and they will come out with the right political decisions. And I want to say, if it is, as Knox says, catching fire, it has old roots. one that we're still contending with today, contending in our current discussions of the First Amendment, I would suggest, and these are two texts that in some ways, particularly the second, influence the First Amendment. Shakespeare just giving us the phrase, I will tell you news of your son, give me your blessing, truth will come to light. Murder cannot be hid long, a man's son may but be at the length, truth will out. And that is the idea that truth will always come to the surface. More famously put by Milton in Areopagitica, though all the winds of doctrine be let loose to play to earth, truth and falsehood together, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting misdoubt her strength. Let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. And that influenced Locke, who influenced very much the First Amendment, and there we can see it. And there again, this proliferation of information being built on assumptions like that. And with that, I want to say that there's a kind of materialism developing across, again, the 18th century, or determinism developing. Berkeley, or Berkeley as we say here, and of course the university is named after the philosopher Berkeley, he says that we're unable to tell how the body acts upon the spirit. A Cartesian challenge, can the mind be determined by the body? Can we reflect one on the other? Whereas Priestley, looking at David Hartley, the philosopher, says the one great comprehensive law shall be found to govern both the material and the intellectual world. And when you look at Hartley, who Priestley is talking about, it's information, basically. He has an idea of the mind being guided by vibrations, and those vibrations, whether they're material or spiritual, in some ways are what he calls the fundamental source of them is information. So we come up with an idea in the 18th century, which I want to say we still have to some extent now, that information in some ways is deterministic. Let me move a little faster. But I want to say that we have a term now which is being used in three sort of distinctive ways. Unlike instruction or education, information can be the input. It's the stuff from outside that affects how we think. It can be the process, as we saw in Locke, by which we come to think, and it can also be the outcome, the stuff that we develop through thinking. And when you have a concept that is both input, process, and output, you have a highly deterministic view, and I think it's something that we're still wrestling with. And perhaps I can give you my image of that. We get outside sensation, that's information. No, information runs along our veins. No, information is the idea that we have in our head. No, information is the stuff that we put out into the world. And we still use the term, and they wrestled with this in the 18th century. They began to say, well, is therefore information universal? A Democrat, Thomas Reid, one of the Scottish Enlightenment figures, said the informations of sense are common to the philosopher and the most illiterate. We can share information because we're all the same. Barrington argues that our nerves are actually just like the brain. They're taking in information in an irresistible and ineluctable way. So let me, quickly as I can, keeping an eye on time, just try to wrap this together. So what you see by the end of the 18th century is this spread of information, this enthusiasm for information, things that we've seen in the last 50 years, and also doubts about information. Do we want this, how can we reckon with this deterministic stuff? And as I said, we see this in the 20th century. If you saw that figure I just drew, not only is it in some ways like much of the work going on virtual reality, all we have to do is impinge on the senses and the brain will work in highly predictable and responsive ways. Someone as influential as Vannevar Bush says we know that when the eye sees, all the consequent information is transmitted to the brain by means of electrical vibrations. There's David Hartley, absolutely renewed. And then he begins to say, and might not these currents be intercepted? Can't we get in there and play with those? Because we know how to put information in there. We can do it. And in fact, people are starting to talk about education being something we can simply inject into the nerves, the nanobots that can go into the nerves, because all it is information being processed through the nervous system. And Norbert Wiener saying, Again, that idea of reeds, of universal understanding. The first duty of the legislator to make unambiguous statements which the common man will interpret in one way and one way only. Sounding again very much like Knox. Give the people the right information and they will do the thing that is right. We've now got a great technocratic view. And as people worried about that idea that this is wholly deterministic, the people who are developing the theory, Hartley and Reid, who I mentioned earlier, get a little nervous, but they have an escape clause. What they can say, as Hartley says, is the veracity of God seems to engage him to take care that all those intimations of nature should give us the right information. And Reid makes much the same argument. We'll rely on God. If information is going to shape us, if it's not really a question of our accessing to it, it's simply we're passive recipients, but we can rely on God that he'll be giving us the right stuff. So let's not worry about that. It comes into the 20th century in a slightly different form. God, although McLuhan was religious, isn't really there, but the determinism again, is still very strongly there. This stuff is irresistible. McLuhan, and you'll have to excuse the inherent racism in this quotation, spiritual and cultural reservations of the Oriental peoples that they may have towards our technology will avail them not at all. The effects of technology do not occur at the level of opinions or concepts, but alter sense ratios or patterns of perception without any resistance. And it's information that he's thinking that's doing that to us, and we're starting to use information in that way. And even I want to suggest in economics today, Akerlof, again another Berkeley figure, who introduced the idea of markets malfunctioning because of information asymmetry and won the Nobel Prize for it, and it's a very powerful argument, I find, until you stop and think, but what could he mean by information symmetry? Does he therefore mean that when everybody has the same information, they will all draw the same conclusions and act in the same way, and therefore will have perfectly functioning markets? And is that any different really from what McLuhan is claiming? And neither of these really have the God escape clause that the 18th century had. And then in that, then, one of the questions from the 18th century that comes up is, in some sense, the resistance to that, to starting to say that men of different intellectual capacities should, from the same information, believe precisely the same thing alike is nonsense, says Watson. Or Paine, Thomas Paine, human language is local and therefore incapable of being used as the means of unchangeable and universal information. And as I suggest with those two things at the top of the page, they're one of the figures that is never really read into this argument, but is enormously important, but is now one of the most figures that someone like Lewandowski cannot avoid day in, day out, is of course Bayes. And Bayes produces this very strange Bayesian argument. Why? To try to defend miracles from being attacked by David Hume. So our most advanced mathematics of today, in fact, is written in defense of miracles in the 18th century, but it is also one in which wants to suggest that we have to take into account priors and prior states before we start assessing information. And sometimes today, I still think we have to deal with that. Very quickly, I want to suggest that as we come into the 20th century, we have ideas again that information is this freestanding, autonomous stuff. Paul Otlet, the Belgian figure who's really the father of modern library and information science, has the idea, an idea you can trace it back to David Hume in some ways, that what you need to do with books is take all, and Knox has this same argument in the 18th century, is take all the fluff out, and what will survive is the information. And this information can now be moved around and travel on its own, independent of its source, independent of its priors, it will just stand as information, because information has this romantic autonomy. And that drives very much of theory into the 20th century. And in I want to suggest it's what Google did with Google Books. Who cares about the material form? We can digitize the information. And and also, it's a challenge in some ways to McLuhan, because it's taking us to an idea, not that the medium is the message, but now that just the information on its own is the message. And one, I think that in some ways, although we like to accept McLuhan's nomination of the age, we tend to say, no, we'll leave the medium aside. Focus on information. It's autonomous. Another question of where we see that move is at Bell Labs with Ralph Hartley, who says, who's a great influence on Shannon, and he says, look, just take the psychological stuff out. We'll go for the semantic. We'll take that away. All we want is the syntactical. Another idea, in some sense, that information is autonomous, though here, in some ways, I would suggest with Shannon, he makes information far more subjective than we're usually willing to acknowledge or discuss. And that comes to me in some ways, takes us back almost to Plato, because I find one of the most challenging arguments to deal with in ways in the Charmides, one of the books that isn't discussed in the discussion of information, where Socrates asked the question, if you are looking for advice from a doctor, you go to the doctor, how do you know that the device you get is reliable? And he produces this wonderful Socratic dilemma here of, if you can judge the advice, you don't need the doctor. And if you needed the doctor, you can't judge the quality of the advice. And of course, what we tend to do, I mean, it's one of the extraordinary things about Wikipedia, is that it says, the idea that people who are going to an encyclopedia to discover are the best people to correct that encyclopedia if it's wrong is a highly problematic understanding. Once we confess our ignorance, we're not the people to be able to put it right. One of the things we know in this case, of course, is that when we go to the doctor, and part of the time we're looking over the doctor's shoulder at all those certificates on the wall that's saying, they went to this university and that they got the AMA, and all those institutions, a little like all the material books, are bearing down on the information, yet we're constructing a world that I say, I think the world of books in the 18th century constructed, where the idea of information is entirely separable from the context in which it came, is still with us today. So we have arguments that information wants to be free because it's an autonomous romantic subject against ones that perhaps it needs to be constrained, or perhaps, as Brand himself said, it needs to be expensive. So what I want to suggest, and excuse me for going on rather long, is that across the century, the 18th century, you see these different concepts of information developing, yet being bound together by the same word. Some of them are highly deterministic, some of them are highly physical, some of them are highly romantic, seeing information as autonomous stuff, independent of social factors and institutions. I wrote a book co-authored a book in 2000 which had social and information in the title, and at the time people were like, what has social got to do with information? Of course, had I written it in 2018, I'm saying, well, of course, social and information, they all come together, but in a very different sense. We still have an autonomy, I think. But we have within the concept, and certainly within the word, ideas of meaning and meaninglessness, of subjectivity, as I suggested, objectivity, of information and noise. One of Shannon's challenges is that in some ways, what he calls noise can also be defined as information under his definition, although he wants that to be a binary. Notions of redundancy, sticky, leaky, I won't go into, and then of the sort of famous trilogy of knowledge, information, and wisdom coming from a T.S. Eliot poem that nobody reads, and there's good reason they don't read it either. One suggestion we might be able to bail in a way is from information technology itself, that maybe these are different layers. I'm not sure if that's a plausible assumption, but it's one that we can bear, and at least then the idea that different layers can only speak to each other in highly constrained ways. But on that, having taken us from Plato to TCP/IP, let me stop there, and thank you for being patient enough to listen.